welcome to another guide. Today we're just going to be going over some melee DPS kind of rotations and overviews on where to go and how to start with the melee style. So to start, we're going to kind of take a look at the gear that I'm going to be using for this guide, and then I'll show you a little bit more of the slightly higher end upgrades that you can do, but this, along with the going theme of all my things, are about mainly non-best in slot, just how to get started and your square one. So to start, we're going to kind of ignore everything at the bottom. That's all for later. So if you're getting into melee, you pretty much want three things. One is going to be your two-hand weapon, and then the other two are obviously your dual-wield weapons. So for your gear, I do have the Zuck cape. I highly recommend that you get that for any of the styles. It's just really, really strong. I do have a guide, and there's plenty of guides all over on how to do normal mode Zuck. It's very, very straightforward nowadays, especially if you're using necromancy. It makes it quite easy. I will have a link in the description on my normal mode Zuck guide if you want to take a look at that, but I highly recommend it. It's going to help your damage a lot in any of the styles you use, whatever Zuck cape you want to go for. Beyond that, we have the Jaws of the Abyss. I really suggest you get that. It's a very cheap helmet, and it's just kind of really good all the way through all of your melee things, even if you have vestments. If you find yourself down the road ever using the Scourge, it helps with your adrenaline gain. There's a basic dismember, which kind of really helps with adrenaline gain, especially with berserk rotations. And it's just cheap. I really recommend getting it. It's really good to camp for quite a while. I have the Blood Amulet of Fury. It's a cheap, pretty good necklace, and it gives you extra healing, which when you're learning and you're practicing your Zerk rotations, that honestly helps a ton. I have both of the tier 85 Langs. You do not need to start off with the really expensive ones, obviously, but I suggest starting with these instead of Drygores, and I suggest starting with them over Scourge for one main reason, and that's they do have a weapon spec. So by using these, it's a really good way to, without any other switches besides for a two-hand, it's a really great way to kind of start learning how to incorporate weapon specs into your rotation. You're not worrying about EOF specs, so it's just a kind of a good starting point of adding more to your rotation than just your basic abilities and thresholds. For my gear, I'm just using Bandos. It is augmentable, you absolutely can, but it's just it's decent power armor. It gives you some damage bonus. Again, this is just a step one of where to go. You can certainly use masterwork armor, trimmed masterwork armor, vestments. All of those are much better, but this does not degrade. It's power armor. It's pretty solid. It has a prayer bonus. It's just nice to use. And then for my gloves and boots, I'm using Gloves of Passage. I have the enhanced ones. You do not need to use the enhanced ones. You can just use the normal ones. And laceration boots. One bladed dive with a dual wield is nice for a lot of places, especially if you're doing Raksha or anything like that. But beyond that, they're just really cheap power armor boots that just give you a damage bonus, and they're just pretty nice. Again, highly suggest it. We have the Ring of Death. If you have any of the upgraded rings, Champion rings, Reaver rings, Asylum Surgeon's ring, that's from a quest, which is free, so that's really nice. But any ring really that you have, just use the best that you've got. It really doesn't matter. We have armor spikes. You can make these with smithing. You don't have to use them. It just kind of are a little bit extra damage because you might as well. And then for my book, I'm just using a Book of Chaos. You can obviously upgrade that to any of the God Wars Dungeon 3 books. And the only thing I would say avoid is do not use a full book At the very least, don't use it while you're learning, because while you take increased damage from Zerk, and then at full procs, you're taking even more damage, and let's say you're using a Berserker Aura, you're taking even more damage. All of that is going to make it really easy for you to die really quickly, and that can get pretty frustrating. So I would highly recommend avoiding the full book, and honestly, I would recommend avoiding the Berserker Aura while you're learning. Then once you kind of figure out bosses, once you figure out what you're doing, you can incorporate flicks and stuff, then definitely start pushing for those, damage increases. And also, one other thing that's great for melee is while you're learning, you can always swap that book out for a Scrimshaw of Vampirism, which is just another healing source. So that paired with the Blood Amulet, really helpful for while you are learning your Berserk rotations and your melee rotations. So that's the gear. And then the last thing is your two-handed weapon is your Lanny Spear. You can use a Lanny Spear, you can use a Dragon Rider Lance, you can use the Mizuyari, which is a spear from ED1, you can use the Masterwork Spear, you can use a Noxious Scythe. Anything works. So honestly, start with whatever's in your budget. I'm using a Lanny Spear just because it has halberd range. It's really cheap. It's really good. You can see it's Toxic Fang passive for anything that's poisonable. I typically use it as my Slayer weapon, just because I can, but it's honestly just a really great starting point. And for melee, it is notoriously the switch-scape style. So I would say when you're learning, the greatest way to start learning is to have your dual wield and two-hand and start incorporating those two switches. Beyond that, for mage, range, and even necromancy, you can get away with not using an adrenaline potion. Honestly, it's obviously good to use. It's a great habit to get into, but it's not the end of the world if you don't have or use them, because Sunshine and Death Swiftness last for so long, especially if you have the greater version, and necromancy with the stacks, how those work is actually pretty adrenaline free if you do it, properly, and you use stacks in a smart way. But melee is pretty starved for adrenaline at the start until you have all the best in slot upgrades. It's pretty painfully starved for adrenaline, and on top of that, if you don't have vestments, Berserk does not last a long time. It only lasts 20 seconds. So I really suggest, if you're doing melee, use whatever your best adrenaline potion is. Either a normal adrenaline potion, a super adrenaline renewal, anything you can use, absolutely use it. It will increase your damage tenfold. So with that, we're going to just get into some rotations using specifically this gear, and then we'll go over a couple more slightly better rotations and other options that you can have available to you. We are going to get into the meat and potatoes. So for starters, with melee, I would say step one is setting up your action bar in a way that you can switch between your two-hand and your dual wield easily. Now, for me, I have F1, F2, and F3, and you can see I have my weapons dragged on there, so that way if I hit F1, I swap to my two-hand, and if I hit F2 and F3 at the same time, I swap to my dual wield. And that's just how I do it. That's where my hand sits, and that's how I do it with all styles. Is F1 is my two-hand, and 2 and 3 are my dual wields for mage, range, everything. So I would suggest whatever you do, make it a constant through all styles and everything, so that muscle memory is kind of permanent, and you don't need to figure out to change when you're changing styles around. So that's step one, is making sure you can kind of seamlessly swap between your weapons. And once you do that, we're going to kind of get right into it. So as you can see, I have my basics on Revolution. It's honestly totally fine. You can absolutely do this. The only basics I don't are Greater Fury, Punish, and Dismember. Now, you can absolutely make your Revolution bar a little bit bigger and throw Punish in there, or Dismember. And I would honestly suggest probably putting Dismember as your very first ability, especially if you're using the Jaws, because that just for its entire duration, whenever it's active, and it'll be active as much as possible, you're always going to be gaining extra adrenaline on hit. So that's definitely really big to do. Beyond that, I just have Sever first. It reduces the target's damage by 10%. It's kind of always keeping itself active, and again, melee takes a lot of damage, so that's just really good. I obviously can't turn off the fact that I have upgraded abilities, but I have Greater Fury outside because it's 15-second cooldown, and you really want to almost look at it as a threshold where you're doing it manually, because the next ability you fire after it has a 100% crit rate chance, and it's gonna hit hard. So I would almost look at that as a threshold. And same with Punish. It has a really long cooldown because it specifically does 2.5 damage if your target is under half health. So you kind of want to save that for those scenarios where you're only using it when they're under 50% health. So again, that's kind of like a threshold in my eyes. So everything else is just running as is. And we're going to get into a standard Zerk rotation. So you're going to start with, and I'm going to treat it almost like you're in the middle of a fight, right? There's some places where I don't mind pre-building, but as a learner, I'm kind of against pre-building as a concept, because everything you're doing right now, you should be learning kind of on the fly as you're fighting, as you're doing things. And I'm going to do it this way because I'm not going to be using Greater Barge, because I don't want to assume you have that, and it's not something that you need right away. I wouldn't say that should be your very first priority upgrade. So we are going to use our Berserk, use our Adrenaline Potion, and as soon as we see any of those thresholds off cooldown, you're going to use it. And then you're going to go back to doing your basics, and again, you see the thresholds on cooldown, you're just going to use it. You're going to hit another basic, and maybe we'll do the Greater Fury and our weapon spec, and that's pretty much the whole thing. You could have done Greater Fury and Overpower. You could have waited and built up and done Overpower right away, and those are only possible if you have the Zuck Cape. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty hard to get anything other than just like one Overpower. But that's kind of your basic idea for Berserk. Is you're going to use Berserk, you're going to use your Adrenaline Potion, and then as soon as you can do a weapon spec, Overpower, any threshold, you're just going to use them. You don't need to worry about any rhyme or reason or kind of prioritizing. That's really all there is to it. After your Zerk is done, and let's say it's on cooldown, we're waiting, you can either, for me, I have it defaulted that my two-hand has all of, the Meteor Strike, the two-hand abilities, and my bleeds, because typically down the road, you're going to be doing all of this with a Masterwork Spear. So in your head, after your Berserk rotation, you can swap to your two-hand, and you can use all of your bleeds, because those are not boosted by Berserk, while you're waiting for Berserk to come off cooldown. And then, after you throw all your bleeds, while you're still on your two-hand, something that's really cool that you can do, again, mid-fight, or you can honestly do this rotation before your Berserk rotation, if you want to, is you're going to do your Meteor Strike. So what we're going to do this time is, instead of just a normal Berserk rotation, we're going to kind of look at it as a full encompassed rotation, where we're going to do Meteor Strike first. I'm going to throw my Dismember on, and then I'm going to swap back to my two-hand weapons, and I'm going to build to Berserk. And hopefully, if everything goes well, we're going to have that Meteor Strike crit bonus for a portion of our Berserk rotation, which is going to be really, really nice. So we're going to start with Meteor Strike, and then we're going to use Dismember, and now we're gaining more adrenaline on our basics, so we can build up to our Berserk, and we're just letting that ride. It's really all there is to it. And now I can Berserk an Adrenaline Potion and instantly do that. And now I have, 10-15 seconds of that crit bonus on. So if I want to, I can use Chi Fury and Overpower, and I'll have it pretty darn close for the whole duration of, that crit bonus. So you're just kind of looking to stack and supplement. So now it's on cooldown again. We're going to swap, and we're going to go back to our two-hand where we're just kind of doing our bleeds, and then we're letting it ride. He might be under 50% health, so you're going to use Punish. You could probably use your G Fury and like a Hurricane here while we're just waiting for this to come off cooldown. If you happen to have Greater Flurry, you can use that to reduce that cooldown. Otherwise, again, we're just going to throw our Meteor Strike, and we're building back up to 100% while we're waiting for this cooldown. You can swap back to your dual wields, just building and waiting and kind of hoping. There we go. We have that. Our Adrenaline Potion's on cooldown. That's fine, because you can honestly use Greater Fury, and even if you just use a basic, that crit with the crit bonus is going to give you a big adrenaline gain. And that'll bring you back to being able to do your thresholds in your Berserk. And then you could do a weapon spec, and that's pretty much how it's going to roll, is you're going to be rotating through your two-hand of doing bleeds, Meteor Strike, building back, doing your Berserk, and then just dumping damage. The way I would look at it is, if I had to prioritize, you have a few options. If you know for a fact that you do not need to move and you can stand still, you're not going to do anything, you can absolutely just kind of use Assault, then use Destroy, then use Flurry. That's totally not a problem if you just kind of want to take your Zerk rotation and just let it ride as channeled abilities. Alternatively, if you want to prioritize that, you use Greater Fury into an Overpower, and then you're going to kind of look at the timer and probably run any of the channeled abilities, and then towards the last 3 seconds of your Berserk, assuming you have a couple stacks that reduce the cost of the weapon spec, you're just going to throw your Icy Tempest weapon spec. So priority would be, in my head, Overpower, then your channeled abilities, then your weapon spec at the end. I also have Chaos Roar. I wasn't using it, but if you have it, it's kind of, you can alternate between using Greater Fury to boost an ability, and then Chaos Roar to maybe boost your weapon spec, or boost any of the channeled. So that's pretty much the whole overview on doing your normal, typical Berserk rotations. So now that you've kind of practiced and have your your normal, standard, basic step 1 Berserk rotations down, we're going to move on to kind of pushing it one step forward, one step further, and we're going to be adding one more weapon spec. And if I had to kind of give a progression, an order, an upgrade order, it would say you can choose, honestly, between a spear and a Zeros Godsword, but I always suggest a Zeros Godsword first. That is due to the fact that it kind of works as a 2-part for when you're getting into melee. First, it's basically a mini Berserk. So anywhere that you're needing to do some extra damage, but you're not comfortable taking extra damage, you could just use a ZGS instead. It costs less adrenaline, so you're not wiping out 100% adrenaline. But you're also not doing as much damage, but you're not taking any extra damage. So it's a great way to kind of mitigate that and do kind of like a mini Zerk while you're learning. And the second reason is, if you noticed, if you don't have Greater Flurry and you can't reduce the Berserk cooldown, then after your Berserk and before you did that Meteor Strike, there was a pretty hefty amount of downtime where you were just kind of doing basics and not really doing much of anything. And that's where the Zeros Godsword comes into play. So you can have one and I would honestly suggest having a physical one. I threw mine in an EOF just because I'm lazy and I didn't want to add an extra switch to my already bajillion switches, at least not a manual physical one. But I would suggest that you start with having a physical ZGS, because you can use that instead of a landing spear as your two-hand weapon for your meteor strike, for your bleeds and all that, while you're saving up for a spear. And then on top of that, you want to use its spec. So I'm going to equip the ZGS. So again, we're doing our berserk rotation, we're drinking our adrenaline potion, we're gonna use G Fury, we're gonna use overpower, we're gonna build up again. We have a few seconds left, so we can send an assault. We have and right on the tail end of it, we're gonna just send our weapon spec, and there you go, there's your full berserk rotation. And now while we're waiting, you're gonna use your weapon spec, or if you have an AOF, you're gonna use your ZGS. And this is just going to give you 20 seconds of increased damage while you are kind of waiting for berserk to come back. So you can then swap, you have your ZGS on, you can do all your bleeds. You still have 16 seconds and we're close to 100%, so maybe throw like a hurricane. And now we're building back, and it's kind of perfect timing where we can use our meteor strike, we can use dismember to kind of help get us a little bit extra adrenaline, and we're just waiting for our berserk to come back. And as soon as it does, we can use it. You can see we have 15 seconds still of that crit buff. So again, you can use greater fury and whatever, any ability just for the extra. Use dismember to get a little bit extra adrenaline back, and you're good to go. Again, on the tail end, we're going to use our spec, and that cycle is going to kind of rinse and repeat itself. Again, use your ZGS. You're going to have your bleeds. You can just use all your bleeds, build to meteor strike, then use your berserk, and the cycle continues. And obviously throughout that, if you're doing bossing, you're going to want to deal with the mechanics that you're getting as well, so it's not always going to line up quite so perfectly as if you're attacking a dummy that doesn't attack back. But either way, that's pretty much the standard overview of your kind of three main parts of doing melee. Is you have your berserk rotation, you have your ZGS, and you have your bleeds, and then adding in between is your meteor strike. And that's the whole kit and caboodle. Make sure you use your adrenaline potions. They're really, really helpful. And then just for a little bit, we're going to take it just one step further. There is the easy K, which obviously you'd want to use with a spear. That's pretty end game. If you're at that point, you probably do not need this video. So you can see, there's so many things you can add, switches you can add to melee. I have a whole bunch of different EOFs. There's hammers, there's Ceridome and God Swords. If you're in a position where you kind of need some panic healing, there's that. But there's all these switches that you can add. But again, if you're at that point, probably do not need this video. The only thing we'll be going over is the Scourge, because it is much cheaper, obviously, than the tier 95 Langs, and it does cause a parasite bleed stack with every hit, and that is a bleed, so it kind of means your target is permanently bleeding, which stacks incredibly well with the Jaws of the Abyss. The only downside is if you're using that instead of the Dark Ice Shard, unfortunately you do not now have a weapon spec to use, because that's off the main hand, not the offhand. So you kind of need to, if you still want to be using that weapon spec, it's just obviously one more switch where you need to kind of switch to it, use the spec, and then switch back to the Scourge, which is very honestly fine to do. And in all things melee, that is a very minor switch, so it might honestly even be worth adding just to kind of give you practice doing a little bit more switching. And it's obviously not essential, but it might help. And then you'll see I have this offhand Drygore rapier with lunging 4 on it, and the reason I have that is the Scourge has a maximum of 50 stacks, and if the target is under 50 stacks, bleeds help increase the stacks. They also apply the parasites. So at the start of a fight, after using Berserk with the Scourge, I will switch to the Rapier, use Dismember, and then switch back, and that makes Dismember hit harder, and it helps build my 50 stacks faster. Typically, you want to use all of your bleeds with your Spear. If you don't have a Spear, you can use all of your bleeds with the Scourge, totally fine, but that's what that's for. So if you're looking for perks and you're doing this kind of setup, you could always throw it on the offhand, and then it's not a switch, then you just have it forever. Especially if you kind of have that as the first thing on your Revo bar, it just helps that do increased damage. But you'll see now, if I use Berserk and then I use Dismember, plus I have the Parasite stacks, I am getting so much more adrenaline on all my basic hits, where as before it was much harder to get all that adrenaline. So I was able to fit almost the same exact rotation in without even using an adrenaline potion as I was without having just that singular addition, which is the Scourge. And that's why I would suggest probably getting that before. It's a good middle in between of really strong, really helpful, but not as expensive as actual Langs. And beyond that, I hope you have some good luck. I'm just going to take this exact setup, this exact gear, and I'm going to go do a few kills at Vindicta just so you can see the damage potential, the damage output in an actual use scenario, as opposed to just beating the crap out of a glorified wooden pole. So beyond that, enjoy, good luck, and I hope this helps. Alright, so we're going to start at Vindy. You can see I have a Steel Titan, the Adrenaline Potions. I'm just using normal overloads because, again, non-best in slot. Same gear, I'm not using the Scourge, I'm using the Langs, the book, and because we're going to say we're learning Pendants, use Vampirism, use anything that makes sense for you. And best of luck.